This is a presentation for designing reverse firewalls for the real world, a joint work with Xavier Bultel, Pierre-Alain Fouque, Cristina Onete, and Thyla van der Merwe. First of all, what exactly is a reverse firewall? A simple definition would be to say that where a regular firewall will protect a machine or user from threats coming from the outside world, a reverse firewall will actually protect a user from some corruption of cryptographic implementation on their own computer. The idea in this scenario is that some cryptographic implementation on the user's laptop will be corrupted, and some adversary who is listening to the outgoing traffic will try to exfiltrate some information using this implementation. For example, maybe the implementation was modified in such a way that outgoing messages will start with the corresponding bit of some private key or any sort of private information. The adversary will thus be able to listen and recompute or deduce the value of the private information. As we see on the illustration, if there is a reverse firewall sitting between the internet and the computer, that reverse firewall will be able to randomize or re-randomize the outgoing traffic, and this way the adversary cannot deduce anything. If we have a look at an example, let's imagine that Alice and Bob are exchanging messages. The reverse firewall will re-randomize its owner's output. So in the first case, the reverse firewall belongs to Alice. Let's say that Bob will send some group element, for example his public key, and Alice will answer with 2 encrypted messages. When the first message comes through, so Bob's public key, the reverse firewall will simply forward it to Alice, having accepted that it's a good element, for example, maybe checking that it's not 0 or 1. And when Alice answers with 2 encrypted messages, the firewall will randomize them in a way that Bob will be able to decrypt them, but in such a way that no observing adversary could deduce any information from them. Now, if the firewall is on Bob's side, when outputting the public key, the firewall will randomize it. And when receiving the encryptions from Alice, which will correspond to the randomized public key, the firewall will, in a way, de-randomize them so that Bob can understand or actually decrypt them properly. Let us now dive a little bit deeper into the theory. A reverse firewall is meant to preserve what security exists, and of course this means that whatever protocol the reverse firewall is protecting should still work properly when a reverse firewall is present. And of course, the reverse firewall should provide exfiltration resistance, which is the formal notion that we presented before, meaning that a corrupted machine should not leak any information through the reverse firewall, which basically means that if the reverse firewall is present and active, well, it works. In the 2 articles that introduced reverse firewalls, the authors focus on ASA, algorithm substitution attacks, against AKE, so authenticated key exchange protocols. These 2 articles are Cryptographic Reverse Firewalls by Mironov and Stevens Davidovits in Eurocrypt 2015, and Message Transmissions with Reverse Firewalls from Dodius and the original authors at Crypto 2016. Their idea is to simply modify a simple basic Diffie-Hellman key exchange where the reverse firewall will re-randomize and mold the commitment of the initial sender. So, for example, if the initial sender is Bob, Bob will send a commitment of his public key to the reverse firewall, who will generate a random element alpha and randomize and mold the commitment into com prime, which the reverse firewall will then forward to Alice. At this point, Alice will send her own Diffie-Hellman share element, so here A, and send it to the reverse firewall, which will randomize it using the same random alpha and then send it to Bob. And finally, Bob will open the commitment that he sent at the beginning, which the reverse firewall will modify into an opening of the commitment that it sent to Alice at the beginning. There are some limitations in the original articles. The first being that their notion of functionality maintaining of a corrupt implementation is too strong, meaning that in their proof of security, the implementations that an adversary is allowed to provide is too restrictive, and we believe that it actually excludes some attacks that actually are realistic and should have been actually considered. Then, and this might be a more personal opinion of ours, we think that the notion of exfiltration resistance, the security property of exfiltration resistance, is too vague and not formalized enough. Finally, and this one is actually more problematic, key-dependent messages are not handled in their security notion. This is important because the implementation of the user actually knows the key, so messages that are encrypted can depend on the key, which is not generally the case when considering an adversary in indistinguishability notions. So, when studying reverse firewalls, our aim was twofold. First, we wanted to extend reverse firewalls to make sure that they could actually protect not only the key exchange phase, but also the record layer. In the original articles, only the key exchange is considered. And of course, because we have an extension, it's more like having a new notion, meaning we have to improve pre-existing security definitions or introduce some new ones. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, this is not just some straightforward modification, as the record layer is usually based on symmetric notions, meaning that messages that transit at this phase are much less malleable than the messages that are transiting during the key exchange. As we saw before, during the key exchange, it's actually quite simple to just elevate something to a random power there and then do the same thing when the message comes back the other way around. Let us now have a look at how the security is actually provided in our new definition and in the scheme that we propose. First, it's important to note that our setup is different from the previous setup. Instead of having Alice and Bob talking to each other, we actually have a client-server situation with the client having a reverse firewall. The first modification that we made to what was done previously is that the reverse firewall now has a public key. This actually does not change at all the trust that we have to place in the reverse firewall. The only difference now is that the client and the server will suppose by default that the reverse firewall is present, when in the original articles, Alice and Bob actually considered that the reverse firewall was absent by default. The reverse firewall's public key actually allows us to establish two keys. First of all, we have KCFS, which, as its name kind of indicates, is a key that is shared by the client, the reverse firewall, and the server. And the second key is KCS, which is a key shared only by the client and the server. Using those keys, the format of the messages that are transiting on the channel are actually double encrypted, first with the key shared by the client and the server, and then by the key shared by the client, the reverse firewall, and the server. This means that the reverse firewall is able to protect, re-randomize, and actually encrypt the outside layer without having to know what the message M actually is. To study the security of our scheme and our notion in general, we consider three scenarios. First, we test the authenticated key exchange security of the key KCS, so the key that is shared by the client and the server. In this scenario, the adversary controls a legitimate, active, or passive reverse firewall, does not give some corrupt implementation to the client, and we show that the privacy of the server and the client are still preserved in this case. Then, in the second scenario, we look at the AKE security of KCFS. In this case, everyone is actually honest and follows the protocol, so the adversary does not have access to anything more than the messages that are transiting between the reverse firewall and the server. Finally, we have the most important scenario, where the adversary provides a malicious implementation to the client, and we test how resistant the implementation is to exfiltration if there is a reverse firewall that is present. And the result, in the end, of course, is that the exfiltration resistance is highly dependent on the AK security of KCS and KCFS, of course. As for the security games, the two AK-related scenarios for KCS and KCFS are just the regular authenticated key exchange security game. So the adversary is given a session key and must decide or guess if that key is the real session key or a randomly generated key. For the exfiltration resistance security game, the adversary will provide two functionality maintaining implementations and will have to figure out which one is actually used by observing the protocol playing out. And this time the functionality maintaining definition is based on transcript equivalence, which we believe is easier to grasp than the notion that was in the original articles. So now that we know the theoretical part of the security, let's look at what our construction actually looks like. So let's first look at the case where the reverse firewall is actually passive, and the idea is that the client and the server will both generate two Diffie-Hellman shares, which are meant to become, in the end, KCS and KCFS. As we can see on the left-hand side, the client doesn't just generate random elements, the client will also have to encrypt one of the secret keys to send to the firewall. This secret key is encrypted with the firewall's public key, and that's done in order for the firewall to be able to compute KCFS in the end. The client will send the two public keys and the encryption of one of the secret keys to the firewall, who will just decrypt the encryption and forward what the client sent. This is why the firewall is said to be passive, because there is no randomization in this case. The server, on the other hand, also computes two Diffie-Hellman shares, as I said before, but two random elements as well, which are denoted here with beta 1 and beta 2. Upon receiving the client's public keys, the server will sign the two public keys that it computed, as well as the client's public keys elevate to the two randoms that I mentioned before. Afterwards, the server will simply send the signature, the two public keys, and the two randoms to the firewall. The firewall will then be able to compute KCFS and forward to the client what the server sent, again without modifying the message. The client will then verify that the signature is correct, which will authenticate the server, and will then be able to compute KCS and KCFS. Of course, if the signature isn't verified, then the server is not authenticated, and the protocol will simply abort. At this point, several elements may seem unnecessary, for example, the randoms generated by the server, but it's important to keep in mind that this situation is simply a passive firewall, and we hope that whether the firewall is active or passive, the messages actually look the same, and the client and the server are unable to know if the firewall actually did anything or not. So if we now look at what the protocol will look like with an active firewall, so the differences are in blue, we can see that we do need the messages to look like this before. So on the left-hand side, nothing changes at the beginning. The client will do everything just the same way. Then the firewall will also compute two random elements, denoted here with alpha 1 and alpha 2. Upon decrypting the secret key, the firewall will verify that all that is received is actually a correct element and not like outside of the group, for example, or that the secret key does not correspond to the public key. If everything is alright, then the firewall will simply keep on going, and this time this means re-randomizing or randomizing all of the elements using the random that were computed at the beginning. We see now that what the firewall forwards to the server does not correspond to what the client sent, but is actually a randomization. On the right-hand side, the server, as the client, just acts normally at the beginning and will sign what was received elevated to the random powers that were computed at the beginning. What is sent by the server corresponds to what was sent before. This time, the firewall will actually check that what is received is correct and will then compute two new randoms, which are the multiplication of its randoms and the server's randoms. We see that the message that is sent by the firewall to the client is actually different from what was done before, because these randoms do not just correspond to what the server sent. In the end, everyone is able to compute KCS and KCFS. The simple difference between what was done before and what is done there is that both keys were actually re-randomized by the firewall. So now that we have seen what happens for the key exchange, let's have a look at the record layer. Unfortunately, we cannot just use KCS and KCFS in a straightforward manner by just encrypting and re-encrypting around it. As I mentioned before, we have to take into account key-dependent messages. We take inspiration from previous works on key-dependent messages to obtain the following protocol. The key KCS shared by the client and the server will be used to simply authenticate and encrypt the message that is sent. On the other hand, the key KCFS will have to be used in hash functions and in a MAC function in order to act as a one-time pad for the outside layer of the encryption. I invite anyone who's curious to actually have a look at the article to get some more details on how and why this is important. But just know that as long as the adversary doesn't know or guess the key KCFS, the encryption is entirely equivalent to a one-time pad. So let us now conclude and see what is important to take away from this presentation. First of all, and I won't go into details, once again I invite you to have a look at the paper if you want to know more about this. We implemented our scheme on a modified version of TLS 1.3, and it just so happens that when compared to regular TLS 1.3, there's only a reasonable overhead that is incurred if you use the reverse firewall, which is good news for us, as it shows that reverse firewalls could be used in practice for real. So the takeaway from all of this is that what happened is we revisited what was originally given as the goal for reverse firewalls and defined some new and clearer security model. We constructed a reverse firewall that is good for communication protocols while taking into account both the key exchange and the record layer. Recall that previously, in previous articles, only the key exchange was taken into account. And, well, finally, our solution is actually efficient, which was proven by an implementation for a variant of TLS 1.3. Thank you very much for your attention, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me or one of my co-authors if you have any question or remark. Thank you very much.